Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Fun in the Summertime, Staying Active with Osteoporosis. Before we begin today's webinar, Osteoporosis Canada acknowledges the land that our offices, located in Toronto, are on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with Mississauga of the Credit. My name is Carrie Grady-Vincent, and I'm the Senior Manager of Scientific and Clinical Programs here at Osteoporosis Canada, and I'll be your moderator today. We would like to thank the Collings Stevens Family Foundation for helping to make today happen. The presentation today will provide general information about exercise, activity, and bone health. It is not intended as individualized health advice. If you have questions about exercise, bone health, or osteoporosis, consult a physician or registered physiotherapist. Please note that during the webinar, if you have questions, you can enter them by clicking the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to answer as many questions as we can during the webinar within the time available. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the OC replay webpage within 24 to 48 hours. Today's webinar features Dr. Caitlin MacArthur. Dr. MacArthur is an assistant professor in the School of Physiotherapy at Dalhousie University. She focuses her research on improving the effectiveness of and access to rehabilitation for people living with chronic health conditions across a continuum of care, particularly home and long-term care. Dr. MacArthur to improve the mobility and quality of life of clinically complex older adults, and she is a lead instructor of the continuing education course Bone Fit, hosted by Osteoporosis Canada, which teaches exercise professionals about safe movements, physical activity, and exercise for osteoporosis. She is also an active member of Osteoporosis Canada's Scientific Advisory Council. So without further ado, it is now my pleasure to welcome Caitlin. Take it away, Dr. MacArthur.
All right. Hello, everybody. Let me just get my slides up here for you. Okay, great. So thanks for having me today. I'm really excited to talk today about summer activities. I'm sure where I live in Halifax, we've had quite a heat wave. So I'm sure other people across the country are experiencing that as well and want to get out and enjoy the summer sun. So what we're going to be talking about today, this is just a little bit of an outline. So first, we're just going to talk generally about the benefits of exercise for bone health and some general safety tips. And then I'll get into some specific tips for the following kind of activities and sports. And then we'll have some time for some questions that have come in before, or as Carrie mentioned, if you have questions, you can type those into the Q&A box and we'll try to answer as many as we can in the time we have left. So we have some specific tips for racket sports. So this is going to include things like tennis, badminton, squash, and pickleball, hiking and walking, water sports like swimming, and also stand-up paddleboarding, which is kind of a newer one. Some tips for biking. I know a lot of people really like to bike during the summer. And then lastly, horseback riding. So we'll jump into the kind of general benefits of exercise and activity for bone health. So really, what's really important is to think about the goal of all of this movement and exercise that we're doing. So what are we trying to achieve? So for people with low bone mass and osteoporosis, it's really to prevent fractures. So, you might have been to your doctor and you might have talked about other, measurements of bone health, like maybe a DEXA scan and your T-scores and those types of things. But really what we want to try to do with our exercise is prevent fractures. So if you haven't fractured, then that's really the success. If you have had a fracture, we want to prevent future fractures from happening. And we know that the most kind of predictive thing The thing that helps us predict a fracture the most is somebody's had a fracture before. So even if you've already had a fracture, we want to try to prevent the next one from happening. And really that's our goal with any exercise, any physical activity, any movement, is try to prevent future fractures from happening. So that's really going to be our focus. And we can think about movement in kind of 3 different ways. So we can think about formal exercise. So this would be going to like an exercise class or doing prescribed exercises, maybe prescribed by a physiotherapist, or maybe a personal trainer has shown you some exercises to do. It could be balance exercises. It could be lifting weights. You could be using weight machines or resistance bands. You could maybe be walking on a treadmill or doing specific posture exercises, but it's kind of formal exercise. You've set aside the time in your day. You're thinking, okay, I'm going to do this exercise, and it has a benefit as well, or a benefit, but a goal. So you're thinking, okay, I'm going to do balance exercises because I'm going to make my balance better, or I'm going to become stronger, or I'm going to improve my heart health by walking on the treadmill or running on the treadmill. Next type of movement we can think about are leisure activities. So these are things like any type of sport you play, maybe hiking, walking, biking, swimming. And these are more kind of general activities that you do, because you enjoy doing them. They bring you pleasure. They are also going to have benefits for our body. So they might improve our bone health. They might improve our heart health, all of those types of things. But they're not necessarily, a formalized exercise program. They're movement that you enjoy doing, and it's not necessarily organized or towards a particular goal, but it's something that you like to do. So like walking the dog is a really good example, or going for a bike ride or whatever that might be. And then the last thing we can think about with respect to movement in our day is daily activities. So these are things that we do every single day, but involve movement. So things like cleaning, doing the laundry, doing the dishes, vacuuming, sweeping, gardening, mowing the lawn. Gardening is a full contact sport. Sometimes, you're out there for quite a long period of time. Maybe you're getting in, challenging positions or awkward positions, getting in and out of bed or in and out of the chair, and sitting or standing at work. So depending on if you are working, what your work entails, it might actually involve quite a bit of physical movement as well. So if you work, doing something like construction or a job where you have to move things around a lot, like boxes or whatever it might be quite physical. Or if you're like me, my job pretty much entails sitting here at this computer, especially during COVID times. I do a lot of sitting. And so that can also have a toll on your body. So there it's more the lack of movement, but it's the position that you're in too when you're sitting that's really important. So why I bring all of these 3 things up, what does this have to do with, summertime activities? It's just important with osteoporosis and low bone mass to think about how we are moving, and that, can take different forms throughout the day, whether it's formal exercise, leisure activities, or those daily activities that you're doing that require movement. So with movement, there's a bunch of different ways that we can help prevent fractures. So how can movement help us prevent fractures? So the first one is preventing falls. We know that the majority of fractures happen around a fall. Maybe somebody, loses their balance, or they slip on the ice, or they step into a pothole, or they step into a hole in the grass and they fall, and then they have a fracture because of that. Maybe it's a fractured wrist or a fractured hip or a fractured spine. So that's really, really important, first of all, to help prevent falls. The next way is to move safely. So especially for our spine or our back, it's really important to move safely throughout the day. A lot of spine fractures happen just from unsafe movements or unsafe positions that people get into. And we'll talk about what those are specifically in a moment, but just moving safely is really, really important. So a lot of times people think about, the specific exercise that they're doing, whether that's the formal exercise or maybe it's a leisure activity, but they forget about all the little things that lead up to that activity, like bending, sitting in the car, picking things up. those types of things. So just moving safely in and of itself can help prevent fractures. And then the last one is preventing further bone loss. So we know that with exercise, we can prevent further bone loss. We might not be able to increase our bone mass, but we may be able to prevent further bone loss. And we'll talk about specifically how we can do that. So the first one was preventing falls. As I mentioned, many fractures happen because of falls. And how you can help prevent falls with movement is by engaging in exercise and movements that challenge your balance. And these should really be done daily. So things like dancing and Tai Chi are really, really good ways to challenge our balance. We know that to change our balance and to prevent falls, we really have to challenge it. So you want to make sure that you are doing things that challenge it. We also know that muscle strengthening, especially with respect to falls for our lower body, can be really helpful. And this should be done at least 2 times per week. Now, I said lower body, so that would be, our legs and our hips and, everything kind of below our waist. But what's also really important is to strengthen your upper body too, so that if you do fall, you're able to get your hands out and, protect your hip and protect your spine, and maybe even slowly lower yourself to the ground. So kind of absorb the fall through arm strength. So don't forget about your arms too. That's why I put whole body on the slide. And then the other thing that can be really helpful to help prevent falls is working on posture to stay upright. So we know that people who start to develop that rounded forward posture, or like a bit of a curve in their upper body, their balance is actually worse than people who don't have that curve. So we really want to try to keep ourselves nice and upright throughout the day. So this can be as simple as just being aware of your posture, just checking in. So I'm doing a check-in right now as I sit here at the computer. I was starting to round forward a little bit and sitting up a little bit straighter. I can't see you, but I suspect you all just sat up a little bit straighter in your chair or stood up a little bit taller if you're standing. That tends to happen when I talk about posture, but just having a check-in every half an hour, every hour, am I being as upright as possible? And then there's also some specific exercises you can do for your back muscles or for your spine that can help you strengthen those muscles and improve their endurance so that they hold you upright longer throughout the day. Again, as Carrie mentioned at the beginning, this is not an individual session, so I'm not going to go into what those specific exercises are. That would be where you want to get some individual one-on-one strategies and some prescription for exercises that are best for you. So the second way that I mentioned was moving safely. And so really this is to protect your spine through safe movements in everyday and leisure activities. So, the things that we do every day, we often put ourselves in rounded forward postures, but also throughout formal exercise and those leisure activities. So we're going to talk a lot about some of those spine sparing strategies when we get to talking about the specific kind of exercise or specific activities that you might be doing. So I just said the word spine sparing strategies. So what is that? What does that mean? Basically, spine sparing strategies, they're just what they say they are. They're movements that we want to try to limit to spare our spine, to keep it nice and safe. So there's a bunch of them that we want to limit. So I'll just click through them here. So we want to try to limit mainly flexion, so that's bending forward, and rotation, which is twisting, as well as side bending, so going as far sideways as you can, or any combination of the two. So maybe bending forward and rotating, or side bending and rotating. And it's not that we can't ever do those movements. We just want to try to limit when we do them in certain ways. So we've listed them here for you, and we'll go through each of them. So we want to limit flexion or rotation or side bending that is repeated or sustained. So that means, you're doing it over and over and over, or you're holding it for a long period of time. So it'd be like bending over and touching your toes, 20 times in a row. That would be repeated. Or sustained would be bending over and touching your toes and holding it there for, 15, 45, a minute, something along those lines. Weighted is another one that we want to try to limit. So that would be, doing those movements while holding something heavy. So that could be a laundry basket. That could be a shovel full of snow. Not that we have any snow right now. That could be anything that's kind of got some weight to it. End range movements. So that's basically going as far as you possibly can. So that would be like bending forward and touching your toes and then maybe pulling on your legs to make yourself go a little further. That would be end range, or rotating as far as you possibly can. And then rapid or forceful. So that means doing it really fast or, with a lot of effort. So going like as hard as you possibly can. So some of the activities that we're going to talk about today, you might think, oh, maybe I do some of these movements. Like if you are, rotating through your spine while you're paddling or while you're playing tennis or pickleball, and you're doing it fast and as hard as you can so that you can really hit that ball or you could get a really good stroke. So we're going to talk about how you can modify those things. So it's not that you can't ever do them. It's how can you modify it and make it a bit safer and use some spine sparing strategies. So how can you modify it? Here's some examples. So the first one is doing a hip hinge. So basically this means bending at your hips rather than through your spine. So instead of rounding forward to bend over, you want to try to keep your spine as upright as possible and bend right at your hips. So if you're not sure where your hips are, so a lot of people think that their hips are, if you put your hands on your hips, that's your hips. That's actually your waist. Your hips are a little bit lower. They're right where your pants crease. So if you're sitting down and you look down where there's a crease in your pants, that's where your hips are. Or if you're standing and you lift one leg up and your pants crease, you get a little bit of a line, that's where your hip joint actually is. So we want you to try to bend there rather than rounding through your spine. So I have another little kind of image of that in a second. The next one is doing a step to turn. So rather than, keeping your feet planted and turning through your spine, instead, just keep your spine in line and step with your feet to turn rather than turning with your back. So a lot of these sound, maybe like common sense, but it's sometimes breaking a habit or just being a bit more mindful about it that can be really important. Lifting or lowering to the floor. Maybe you could modify that, or if you could avoid it, if you could make sure things are a little bit higher up, maybe on a table or a couch or something along those lines. Doing slow controlled twists that are not to end range. So, rather than twisting through your spine as far as you possibly can, as fast as you can, could you do it slower? Can you control it and not go as far as you can? Another really important one is balancing loads on either side of your body. So you'll notice in this picture that's on the right, the person is holding 2 grocery bags. And this is much better for your spine because if you hold both grocery bags or something heavy on one side of your body, your spine has to work really, really hard to keep you upright. And when it works that hard, it can actually cause some compression on your spine, which if you don't have osteoporosis or low bone mass is maybe not a big issue, but in the presence of, this disease process, it can become an issue. So if you're carrying grocery bags, if you've got a whole bunch of them, I know I like to load up one side and then have my hand free to, unlock the door or whatever. It's better to split them up and have them on either side. Another strategy you can use is to support your trunk when you flex. So basically what this means is you could put your hand out onto a table or even onto your own thigh. And then when you're bending forward, you have a bit more support. So you're not just relying on your back to work hard and kind of hold you upright. Instead, you're supporting yourself a bit more. And then just holding weight close to your body is really important as well. So rather than holding something far away from your body, if it's heavy, just hold it really close to your center. Hold it close to your chest, close to your belly, and that actually makes it a lot easier to carry. So here's a little cartoon image of what the hip hinge looks like. This image is, I was going to say this person, but it's more of a drawing. This person is doing it with a dowel. Just to give some feedback. So you could also give this a try. Just use a broom handle or a dowel. And if you put it on the back of your head, your back, and then the back of your pelvis, then you just try to keep those 3 spots on the dowel as you bend forward. So you can see they're bending through their hips rather than rounding through their spine. So here's an example of how to do that while tying your shoes. So this would be great if you're headed out for your bike ride or you're headed out for your walk and you're putting on your shoes. You also want to think about how you're doing that. So making sure to use that hip hinge as you do that. Here's another example of how you could do that. So rather than like in this previous one where you cross it over, sometimes we don't have the hip range of motion to do that. That's okay. You can put it up on a platform or a step to help out with that. And then really keeping that spine nice and straight as we bend forward. And then picking up objects from the floor. So here's an example of how to use that hip hinge to be able to pick up something from the floor. So that was our second item. So that was safe movements. The last one is preventing further bone loss. So how we can prevent further bone loss is engaging in resistance or strength exercise. So that's really the best ones, the best type of formal exercise to help with our bones. So this should be at least 2 days a week. And really it should be our whole body that we're working on. Like I mentioned when I was talking about falls, we want to think about our legs, but we also want to think about our upper body and arms. So we should kind of make sure we do a full body rounded, well-rounded formal exercise, formal resistance exercise program. And if you don't have this set up, that's okay. You can definitely get in contact with someone who's bone fit trained who can give you some advice about what to do. There's lots of personal trainers out there who have taken our course. There's lots of physiotherapists who can help you with this type of request as well. So I'll show you in a moment how you can figure out where they are, but it's really important that you get a good program set up and you can follow it, at least twice a week. And it should be challenging. So this is something you have to kind of keep yourself honest about. You really will only want to be able to do about 8 to 12 repetitions of whatever exercise it is. And by that 12th repetition, you should start to feel like you can't do any more. Like you're working hard enough that you wouldn't be able to do more. Or maybe you could only do 1 or 2 more. So this is where you have to keep yourself honest. And I know I have to do this too when I'm doing my resistance training program, is make sure that I am working at a challenging level. So again, if you need some specific advice about this, make sure you seek it out because it's really important to help maintain your function, but also to prevent further bone loss. And then the other way is through weight-bearing aerobic activity. So this would be things like dancing, walking, hiking, things that get your heart rate up but are weight-bearing. So swimming and cycling are not weight-bearing. We're going to talk about that in a little bit when we get into those specific activities. So really, if these are your primary way of kind of getting your cardio or your aerobic activity, you want to try to combine them with other types of aerobic activity to get the best benefit. So if swimming is your thing, you really love to swim, it's what gets you up and motivated. I'm not saying don't swim. I'm saying, incorporate other types of activities too. So maybe you swim, 2 days a week, and then the other 2-3 days you do your walking or your hiking instead. And we want to try to accumulate about 150 minutes per week of this type of activity that's at least moderate. So moderate would mean with respect to aerobic activity or cardiovascular activity, is that let's say you're walking or you're hiking, that you would still be able to have a conversation with the person beside you, still be able to talk to them, but you wouldn't be able to sing. So, you should feel like your heart is beating a little bit faster. You should feel maybe you're sweating, especially in this heat, but you'd still be able to, get a sentence out, but you wouldn't be able to sing. So that's a good kind of marker of if you're working hard enough. So that kind of gives you an overview of the, broad general, when we think about exercise and we think about bone health, these are the things, all of the things that we want to incorporate with respect to movement and how it can help us prevent fractures. So now let's shift gears a little bit and we'll get a bit more specific about some of the summer activities. But first I want to just put up a sign of, how should you interpret what I'm talking about today? So some of these activities are risky. I'm not saying that they are all safe, and they could have a high risk for fracture. So if this is an activity that you are used to doing, you've done frequently, maybe in the recent past, or you're already doing, we're giving you tips about how to continue to do it safely. But if you've never done this activity, I'm not suggesting you start doing it. Because people who have already done it or are currently doing it, have some level of expertise with it. They know how to move their body. They know how to respond to different stimuli in the environment and those types of things. And so it's not like we're saying you should take up these activities, but if you're already doing them and you enjoy doing them, these are ways to keep you safe. So if you're uncertain, you're maybe feeling a little bit unsure, you could definitely consult with somebody. So I would suggest consulting with a physiotherapist who is bone fit trained about your individual risk level and the risks and benefits of the activity, because really it comes down to you individually. You've got to weigh out the risks and the benefits of doing the activity. So is the benefit to you enough that you're willing to take on the risk of that activity? And I can't answer that question for every single person. It's really going to be an individual choice. So definitely consult with somebody about that. So in terms of bone fit trained individuals, as Carrie mentioned at the beginning, Bone Fit is an exercise training workshop that's designed for health and fitness professionals. And they learn in this workshop effective and appropriate exercises and modifications for people with osteoporosis. So they learn all about, what to do, what not to do, those types of things. So how you can find somebody who's trained in your area is you could visit bonefit.ca. And we do have a locator map. So basically you can put in your own address or your work address or whatever address you want. And you can search and you can find all the people close to you who are bone fit trained, and it will tell you who they are. So it'll tell you if they are a physiotherapist or a yoga instructor or a personal trainer or whatever. And so then you can decide who it is that you'd like to see. Or you can also call the number there and they can help you locate somebody. So definitely worth doing if you want some individual advice about what to do. So in general, we want you to think about, if you're thinking about your sport or your activity, your leisure activity, we want you to think about, the transitions. So like I said, oftentimes we think about the activity and is this activity safe? But don't forget about all the ins and outs of that activity too. Like, how did you get there? How did you get your gear on? How did you get your gear loaded? How did you pick up things off the ground? How did you get it in and out of those risky positions? So thinking about the transitions and thinking about some of those safe movements will be important, especially for those transitions. Then think about the actual activity, the actual movement that you're going to be doing. Does it require spine sparing? Or can it be modified? Or, is there something else you could do instead? So these kind of principles can definitely be applied to, if I don't cover one of the activities that you like to do, you could think about these same principles and apply it to the activity that is maybe not covered in this webinar. And then the last one is the risk of falling. So is there a way that you can provide some external support? Is there something you can hold on to? Is there a way that you can make it a bit safer so that you don't fall while doing the activity? Because as I mentioned, many and most fractures happen because of falls. So we want to try to minimize that risk. All right, so let's get into some specific activities then. And how I've kind of organized this is I have the potentially unsafe movement that might happen, why it needs to be modified, so we know why this might be unsafe, and then a modification or a couple modifications for you of how you could change that movement. And I've done this for each of the different activities or sports. So the first one is racket sports. And the first potentially unsafe movement, so it's not even the actual playing of the game, it's picking up the ball or the birdie or whatever it is that you're hitting in your racket sport. So that repetitive flexion, so repetitively bending over and picking up the ball. So how you want to modify that is to use that hip hinge that I showed you before, or you could also use a modified golfer's reach. So the first image here on the left is an example of a modified golfer's reach. So golfers got really smart. I mean, golfers are just really smart people in general, but they got really smart about bending over and picking up the golf ball after each kind of session. And so they use the golfer's reach. So a true like full golfer's reach is when you stand on one leg and you swing one leg out behind you, and then you kind of hinge at your hips and bend forward to pick up a ball. So if you have some balance impairments, or balance is a little wobbly, that might not be the safest way to do it. Instead, you could do something like this called the modified golfer's reach, where you're supporting your trunk with a pole. Could be, if you're playing golf, it might be the golf club. Maybe at your racket sport, it could be a wall or a chair or whatever's near to you. Maybe even your racket. And use that to support your trunk as you use your hip hinge. So you can see she's maintaining a nice long spine. She's not rounding through her spine, and then she's bending over to pick up the birdie or the ball or whatever it is. Now, the one thing I don't like about this picture is she is not really bending her knees. So it's kind of hard to see how she could actually reach the ground. She's quite far from the ground. But you can use the same strategy and really bend through your knees, and then you'll be able to reach the ground and pick it up. Now, if that's not going to work for you, maybe, again, balance is an issue, or you're not sure that that's the best strategy, there's also something called a ball retriever. And so over here on the right is an image of what that looks like. And so you can actually just use this to pick up the ball. It's kind of like a little suction cup on the end of a stick, and you just kind of like stick the ball, and then you can turn it over and you can pick up the ball, so you don't even have to bend forward. So that's one kind of tool that might be able to help you. And here's just, again, an example of that spine sparing strategy. So we've already seen the picture on the left. And what we want to try to avoid is that picture on the right with the rounded forward spine where we're bending over and picking something up. So this could happen if you were bending over to pick up the ball or the birdie from the ground. So instead, we want to try to use that good hip hinge to pick it up instead. The other potentially unsafe movement in racket sports is the swing. So if you think about it, if you are rotating through your spine and you're doing it rapidly and repetitively, those were some of the movements we wanted to try to limit. So how you can do that is really make sure that you're moving as much through your legs and your hips as you can, rather than through your spine. And it will actually probably improve your swing a little bit as well. So making sure that you're really using your legs and your hips to have that rotation, and you're keeping your spine as upright and with as little rotation as possible. So this might take a little bit of practice if it's not something you're used to doing, but it's a really good way to help kind of spare your spine and decrease that repetitive, rapid and range rotation through your spine. The next activity we'll talk about is hiking or walking. So some potentially unsafe movements are first losing your balance or tripping. Or as you become tired, sometimes we get a little bit slouchy or we round through our back a little bit. And so you might be developing some poor posture or some poor postural habits because of that. So these need to be modified. Obviously, if you have a fall, you'd be at risk for a fracture. So if you lost your balance or you tripped on something, then you could be at risk for a fracture there. And then poor spinal alignment can actually increase the risk of falling, like I mentioned before. So we know that people who are more rounded forward because of poor posture and then postural changes have worse balance and are at higher risk of falling than people who are more upright. Also, when you're rounded forward like that, particularly if maybe you're hiking and you're carrying a heavy backpack or something along those lines, it increases spine compression. And that's a major source of spine fractures. It's when we have compression. So when things get squished in our spine, that's when we might have compression fractures. And those are kind of the most common type of spine fractures we have. So one really great modification that overcomes both of these potentially unsafe movements are walking poles. So I always encourage people to use walking poles because it helps provide that external support. So it gives you a little bit more stability, gives you some good balance, and it encourages upright posture throughout. So as you're walking, you're kind of gently pushing down through your poles, and that action of pushing down actually makes you be more upright. And so even as you get tired and you start to round forward, it gives you that more upright posture as you're walking. So walking poles are really, really helpful and can be quite good. So you want to just make sure you get the right type of walking poles for you. Go to somebody who has different types of walking poles and get the ones that are fitted for your height and are right for the type of activity you want to do, because there's different ones if you want to do more of like a faster walk versus a slower walk. So you want to get some kind of individualized advice about that as well. The other sport we're going to talk about is water sports. So the first one is paddling. So the potentially unsafe movement is paddling. So this applies to things like kayaking, canoeing, upright, like the standing up paddles could also apply here, although it's less. And why it needs to be modified is because it can be repeated end range spinal rotation, and it's against the resistance of the water. So you're like pulling against the water. So that's kind of like loading or adding some external weight. So the modification, if you are standing, like if it's stand-up paddle boarding, you just want to, again, try to rotate through your hips as much as possible. Rather than through the spine, and don't go to full range. So don't go through that full range of motion that you can go. Don't twist as far as you can. And then one other really important cue is think about lengthening up through your spine. So like getting taller or as tall as you can be on each stroke. So you don't want to end up in kind of a rounded forward position and then you're also rotating, because we said we want to try to minimize combinations of flexion and rotation. So you want to try to be as upright as possible, and then not going through full range, go with that paddling action. So again, it might be a bit of a habit that you need to think about, but really, really important, especially as you start to get tired. As we start to get tired, we usually kind of collapse down like this. So really think about lengthening up. For swimming, swimming is a great cardiovascular exercise, but as I mentioned before, it's not weight bearing. So it doesn't have as much benefit for our bones. And I always get asked the question, even if I add resistance pads, doesn't that help? It's still not the same as exercising on land, because we're basically minimizing gravity by having the buoyancy of the water. So we don't work as hard, even if we put those resistance pads on. So my modification for swimming, it's great exercise if it's what you love to do, keep doing it, but can you incorporate some weight bearing activities? Could you incorporate hiking, maybe a dance class or Tai Chi, or something that's upright and moving against gravity into your activities? Likewise with biking, I'll just talk about the bottom square first. Great cardiovascular exercise, but not weight bearing. So can you combine it with other weight bearing activities? So similar to swimming. Now with biking and cycling, there are some other potentially unsafe movements as well. So with biking, we're often sitting and then we're bent forward over our handlebars. And so that position, being in a seated position while flexing forward, is not the greatest for our spine when we have osteoporosis. And then falling off the bike could also obviously be a concern. So it needs to be modified because of that seated flexion and sustained. Usually, you might be biking for, depending on your level of biking, you might be biking for an hour or two, or maybe it's just 10 minutes, but anything that's kind of sustained in that sitting position can become an issue. And then falling obviously can lead to fractures. I have seen people have fractures after falling off their bike with osteoporosis. So again, you just have to weigh out the risks and benefits for yourself. So modifications are, you can raise the handlebars so that you're sitting as upright as possible. So, rather than being in a bent forward, like racing position, if you can, bring the handlebars up nice and high so that you're actually sitting more upright. Another thing that I've had people do is take a posture break every 20 minutes, or if you're, only biking for 10 minutes, take a 5-minute posture break. So, a posture break after 5 minutes, maybe not for a full 5 minutes, but after 5 minutes, take a posture break. So stop, stand up off your bike, bring yourself more upright, maybe reach your arms above your head so that you're really lengthening up, and then get yourself back into that position. When you're seated, you could also think about using that hip hinge so that you're not rounding forward, you're instead bending forward at your hips, but keeping your spine as long as possible. For falls, you really want to try to ride on paths that are well paved, avoid uneven ground or unexpected environments. Make sure just be aware of your surroundings, because usually falls might happen if you're like changing terrain or you hit a pothole that you didn't know was there or whatever. So just being aware of your surroundings is going to be really important to make sure that you keep yourself safe that way. And like I said at the beginning, if you're not an experienced cyclist or maybe you're new to riding a bike, this might not be the best activity to take up. But if you're an active cyclist, these are some tips for you. And the last one is horseback riding. Now, full disclosure, I'm not a horseback rider, but I did speak with somebody who does horseback riding to get an idea of what the unsafe movements might be here. So again, the sitting position, similar to bike riding, especially as you become tired or fatigued. So sitting while being bent forward, obviously falling or being thrown could be an issue as well. And then the bouncing was the other part that could be an issue. So if you're, kind of bouncing, the compression on the spine could be an unsafe time there. So it needs to be modified because of that sustained flexion. That falls can lead to fractures, and then that repeated compression as you're bouncing could also lead to spine fractures that build up over time. So it might not be like, one episode of, bouncing for 5 minutes is maybe not an issue, but if you do that, every day for a year, then that could build up over time. So modifications similar to a bike, you want to try to sit up as upright as possible. Obviously, there's no handlebars that you can raise up, but within yourself, if you can try to sit up as upright as possible and really try to bend at your hips, so hinge at the hips rather than rounding forward through the spine, that's going to be ideal. Again, take posture breaks every 20 minutes or so that you get off the horse and you are able to stretch upright, lengthen as much as you can so that you're in an upright position and you're not sustaining it for as long as you possibly can. Similar to biking, ride with a horse that you're comfortable with, confident in their capabilities and your capabilities with them, and in controlled environments so that you're not going somewhere new, that you're not sure what the terrain's going to be like, or if you are going somewhere new, maybe go walk the path first so that you know what the dangers might be. And then for the bouncing aspect, you really want to try to absorb the bounce in your legs as much as possible while maintaining an upright posture. So the concern is, having a lot of bounce while being flexed forward and already having that compression, and then adding the compression of the bounce. So that's kind of what you want to think about with that. All right, so this is where we've been. We talked about the benefits of exercise for bone health. We talked about fall prevention, safe movement, and effect on bone loss. We talked about the importance of resistance and balance training. Those are really going to be the most important parts of your exercise plan, and spine sparing throughout daily life. So I also want to emphasize, we talked today about different leisure activities, which are great. They have a lot of benefits. Some of those leisure activities could also be your balance exercise, because, if you're playing pickleball and you're going for that ball and you're feeling a little bit wobbly, that's a balance exercise. So that's great. Same with stand-up paddling, stand-up paddle boards. You're on the water and you're a little bit wobbly. That's challenging your balance. That's a balance exercise. So that's fabulous. Make sure that you're getting that full picture of movement and exercise. So are you getting your resistance training? Are you getting your aerobic training, your balance training? All of those bases are covered. And then think about how you're moving throughout your daily activities, and throughout those leisure and sports activities as well. So generally, we want to think about the risk for falling. We want to think about the movements that we're actually doing and if they could be modified. And then don't forget about the transitions. So a lot of times we, get doing our thing and we forget all the things that we did to get there and all the things we are going to do to get out of it. So make sure you think about the transitions as well. And then we talked about some specific tips for racket sports, hiking, walking, water sports, biking, and horseback riding. So I might not have covered, I tried to pick some of the more popular activities. So maybe I didn't cover a specific activity that you do, but see if you can apply those same principles that we talked about at the beginning to the activities that you do, and think about, what are the potentially unsafe movements? Where's my risk for falling? Where am I, maybe not in the best position? What are the transitions like, and how could I adapt that? So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. And I'll see if there's any questions.
That was great, Kate. Thank you so much. I got some tips on bike riding that will help me later on today. So we did receive lots of questions. I'll throw a few at you. Some of the questions you did cover in your presentation. We might want to mention that we did a golf webinar in May, so that if there are questions about golfing, you can always go back to the webinar for more details. So let's start with this question. For sports, would it be okay to squat down and pick up the ball at your side?
Yeah, that would be fine, as long as you're not like when you're bending over to pick it up, or when you're like going sideways to pick it up, that you're not doing a huge bend sideways. So if you're like going all the way down and then just picking it up off the ground, that's great, as long as your knees can handle it. Sometimes the squatting all the way down can be a little bit painful, especially if you've got some sore knees, but that's no problem, as long as you're just a little tiny bend sideways is fine. And it'll just kind of, I think the limiting factor will be whether your knees like to bend that far or not.
Okay, thank you. This question is about gentle yoga. This person wants to know if gentle yoga fits as a resistant or a weight-bearing exercise.
Yeah, so we also did a webinar about yoga, so you can check that one out. We talked about some specifics of it. So I would classify yoga more as often it can be a good balance exercise, especially the standing positions where maybe you're on one foot, or maybe you're closing your eyes or whatever. And then also it can help with some of those spine exercises that I was talking about. Some of the yoga poses do actually do some of those specific like spine training or back training exercises. It doesn't count as resistance training. You don't usually work quite hard enough against resistance for it to count as resistance training. Usually you need some sort of external load, like a weight or a resistance band or something to get that resistance. And usually we don't get, our heart rate's up quite as much. So it's not as much of a cardiovascular exercise. But I would consider, especially if the standing poses would be considered weight bearing. So you are standing and you're putting weight through your body against gravity. So yeah, I would consider it balance training, maybe some back training, depending on which, positions and poses you do, but also weight bearing as well.
Okay. Lots of questions here. I'll throw an easy one. Is pickleball safe to play?
So that's an individual, that's not an easy one. That's definitely an individual question. It really depends on your fracture risk level, like if you've had a fracture before or not, if you're new to pickleball, all of those types of things. There actually was a recent study that found one of the most frequent reasons that older adults visit emergency departments is because of pickleball, and the most reported injury was fractures. So I think there are definitely some risks, especially if you're a very competitive pickleball player. You tend to just, push yourself as hard as you can, and you really go for the ball and that kind of stuff. But if you've played pickleball before, maybe you have a lower risk for fracture, you feel pretty confident on your feet, then it could be a good balance weight bearing exercise for you. So it's kind of an individual choice, and that's where it's good to get some advice.
Great. There's a couple of questions concerning knapsack. So I'm going to try to come back for you. This person wants to know if there's any concerns regarding wearing a heavy knapsack while hiking, thinking about whether this adds compression to the spine. And the other person wanting to know if there's concerns about carrying a back on an overnight hike or for a few days, and any weight restrictions.
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I don't have a specific amount of weight that would be safe or appropriate. It's really going to, again, depend on you and your alignment while you're doing your hike and you have your backpack. So if you can maintain good upright alignment throughout, a backpack is okay. I wouldn't put a ton of weight in there. Try to spread it out in other bags if you've got other people with you as well. Again, I can't give you a specific number, but not extremely heavy. Extremely heavy would cause some compression on your spine. But if you have a few things in there, it should be okay. As I mentioned, you want to try to keep yourself as upright as possible while you're hiking. So having those walking poles would be very, very helpful, because it will remind you on each step to kind of lift yourself upright. And as you start to get tired, it will help lift you upright. Also using the clips that go across your chest and your waist can help keep the weight as close to your body as possible. Really, it's the best place for the weight to be is as close to your body as possible. So, as close to your back as possible, or your front, or on either side is going to be the safest place for that weight to be. So again, I can't give you a specific number. I wouldn't go super heavy, but a few items in your backpack should be fine. Just try to keep yourself upright, whether that's reminding yourself to be upright or through the walking poles, and then keep the load as close to you as possible. So use those clips, the chest and the hip clips or the waist clips, to kind of hold the pack as close to your body as possible.
Okay. We have time for a couple more. Any tips on getting in and out of a kayak or canoe?
Yeah, that's a challenging one too. Excuse me. So yeah, the transitions are really, really important. You just want to try to avoid those positions of like spinal flexion and rotation while you're getting in, if possible, or that you're there for a long period of time. So again, it's okay to bend forward and twist a little bit, or if you do it once throughout the day, that might be okay. It's the repetitive nature of it, or going as far as you possibly can. But if you can get the canoe kayak like as close to the dock or wherever you're coming from as possible, get your feet in and then kind of like pivot your bum in. That's probably going to be the best way to do it. If you're coming in from somewhere else, then it might be a bit more challenging, but that's probably my best suggestion for that.
Okay. This will be the last question, and then we'll wrap things. Is it better jogging on smooth country trails or on hard concrete sidewalks?
Smooth country trails meaning like more dirt or something a bit softer, I guess, than concrete.
I would think not specific here.
Yeah. So I think something that's a bit more absorbent of your like pounding on the ground is going to be the best. Just even from a repetitive strain type standpoint. So like thinking about your knees and your hips and your ankles. It's going to be where you have a bit more cushioning is going to be a bit better for that. I don't think from a bone health perspective, it would necessarily matter. It's more from the other joints in your body and how they respond to having a bit more cushioning. So being on a trail that is maybe dirt or like gravel might be a bit more absorbent than being on concrete or asphalt. You just have to be careful about, tripping in those scenarios. So is there like roots across the trail or potholes or whatever? So just, again, being aware of your surroundings while you're on those trails.
Okay. Well, there are lots more great questions, but that's all the time we have for now. For tools and resources to help you manage bone health, please visit osteoporosis.ca. You can use the Calculate Your Calcium tool, and there are more we have podcasts called the Unbreakable. You can find episodes on the website or through your favorite podcast provider. Check out the Know Your Risk quiz, and you can also view the recorded versions of past webinars as well as this on the OC Replay webpage, which is usually available, as I said earlier, in 20 to 48 hours. Again, thank you to our webinar partner, the Collings Stevens Family Foundation. And thank you to Dr. Caitlin MacArthur. Again, wonderful to have you here with us and for providing us with such great practical information. So please get connected by subscribing to our national e-newsletter. You can do that at the top of the OC website to get news, information, and notices, coming webinars directly to your inbox. You can also follow OC on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And until next time, thank you for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your summer with all these wonderful tips from Caitlin. And please continue to stay safe and well and stay connected. Take care, everyone.